seminar today. We have the pleasure of co-sponsoring this event with the Children's National CTSI, Clinical and Translational Sciences Institute, as well as the Biostatistics Epidemiology Consulting Center, or Consulting Service. So BEX for short, that's how I know it. So today, the three of us, as well as the Department of Epidemiology, are pleased to welcome Dr. Scott Quinlan, who's actually an alumni of the department, and he is here to talk about an introduction to the challenges and opportunities of studying drug and vaccine safety in the real world. So without further ado, thank you.
All right, thank you, Joe. So thank you all for coming out on this beautiful first day of spring to listen to my talk today and allow me to introduce an area of research that I've worked in before. I worked before I came back full-time to George Washington. I worked for a consulting company that did a lot of post-marketing research. And it sort of was two groups. One did a lot of effectiveness, and then we focused on safety. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that today. So what am I going to discuss? First, we'll talk a little bit about the importance of this type of research and drug and vaccine safety issues in general. I think we all goes without saying that when we get a prescription or we go to the Target and buy a product, we assume it's going to be safe. But I'll talk a little bit about why this is important and why some of the research in this area is really becoming even more important as time goes along. Also wanted to just very briefly touch on the FDA approval process, really just a couple of moments to kind of point out that while it is one of the most rigorous approval processes in all the world, there are a lot of gaps that we need to think about, which makes this post-marketing research important. And so I'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then what do I mean when I say drug and vaccine safety research? So there's a lot of different areas that we'll talk about. I'll kind of go through very quickly the areas I've worked in before and sort of highlight kind of the different strengths and weaknesses of those different options. And one of the things that's unique about drug and vaccine safety research, and when I talk about that, I mean like post-marketing research, is some challenges and opportunities that we don't always think of in the pre-marketing setting, but are a big issue when we start thinking about things in the post-marketing setting. So I'll talk about those as well. And then I'll wrap up with two topics. One is, I'm going to talk a lot about drug risks today, but I think it's important to recognize that every medication has risks. And so one of the areas that we worked in before is how do you communicate those risks to patients and to physicians in such a way that they can make informed decisions. And so we'll talk a little bit about those challenges as well, and then close with what I think are some future directions, some things to think about as we move forward in time as we continue to study drug and vaccine safety research. And so I wanted to begin just briefly pointing out a few of the safety alerts that have come through really just since the beginning of the year to kind of give you a sense of how much volume we have of these types of issues. And so one is related to clarithromycin, a very common antibiotic. And a long-term study just came out and pointed out that in patients with heart disease, there's some risks to taking clarithromycin that they didn't recognize before. Imodium, some of you may have heard about this in the news. I didn't know until recently that Imodium is actually an opioid-based product. And we all are well aware of the issues with the opioid epidemic, and now there's been reports of people overdosing on Imodium. And so there's a push through the FDA and other groups to potentially regulate Imodium use a little bit more to try to prevent some of these issues. Ocaliva, I'm probably slaughtering the pronunciation, but it's a product that's used to treat people with severe forms of liver disease. And it was approved and it's been on the market. And what they've started to notice is they're having some reports of patient deaths taking this particular product. And what they linked it to through some research was patients with extremely severe forms of liver disease. And they were getting issues with taking too high of a dose. And so in the pre-marketing study, they didn't recognize the dosing for really severe cases of liver disease, and that's led to some recent warnings and a little bit of news on that drug. Cough and cold medicines here at the top. Again, those of us who have kids know that the whole landscape of cough and cold medicines for children has really changed. And a recent alert came out about the use of cough and cold medicines that include some form of an opioid, and essentially telling that the risks of those products in kids is much higher than the benefits. And so there's a lot of push now to get more studies out there to prove really that these products shouldn't be used in children. And the last one that came up very recently was a product called Rolapitant, which is a injectable product used for patients with cancer. And specifically, it's used to treat what's called chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. So we all are well aware chemotherapy can really ravage your body, and one of the side effects is nausea and vomiting. And this product is an injectable that's meant to kind of calm the stomach down and prevent some of those adverse reactions. But what they've recognized recently was that in certain patients it causes severe anaphylactic reaction. And so they've had to do some additional studies to try to find, well, which patients have that issue. And so all of these have led to some alerts, both either through the FDA or other groups, to kind of get us thinking about these types of problems. So first of all, why is this kind of research important? Well, it goes without saying, right? We all go to the physician, we get a prescription, we go to the pharmacy, we fill the prescription, we go to Target, we buy a product over the counter, whatever it is. We all assume that there's been a lot of research that's gone into that product and that it's been proven to work and that it's been proven to be safe before it ever gets to us. But as we'll talk about as we go along today, there's a lot of things that kind of get missed in the studies that are done before a product lands on the market. And so once more people are taking a product, we start to see issues crop up. And so there's estimated, this is an older number, but estimated of about 2 million adverse events are reported to the FDA per year related to medical products that are used every day. And what we see here is there's been a general trend in increasing numbers of these events per year. So as we look along, the blue bars are serious events, which are everything from a hospitalization to a prolonged hospitalization to even up to death. So we're seeing generally an increase in those types of outcomes, and also deaths related to medical products are increasing. Again, this is an older number, but they estimate about 100,000 people die per year due to some form of an adverse event due to a marketed product, and also that this costs our economy about more than $130 billion each year related to people losing work, losing other opportunities because of these adverse reactions. And so we might think about a lot of reasons as to why we're starting to see an increase in these post-marketing safety events. And I think there's a number of factors at play here. I think one of the big ones is our population's aging, and as people get older, they have more chronic conditions and therefore are taking more medical products. And so some of this increase in events that we're seeing, I think, is more a reflection of just the aging population. But I also think all of our, regardless of age, I think the relationship with a physician and medical products has really changed over the last maybe 10 to 20 years, and that most physician visits now end up with some form of a prescription. So about 2/3 of the time people go to the doctor, when they leave, they have a prescription. And it didn't used to be that way. I think there's more of a push now to treat things than in the past there might not have been such a push. And so I think we're seeing, even at younger ages, more people are taking more products. And so this is an estimate from 2000. There was about 3 billion with a B prescriptions filled in the United States. And that number is now over 4 billion as of just last year. So we can tell that I think people are being treated more frequently, not just at older ages, but at younger ages as well. And that leads to another problem, which leads to some adverse events, is people are also taking more than one product simultaneously. And so particularly with older patients, we think of, well, they have lots of chronic conditions, and so they may be taking multiple products at the same time. But even at younger ages, people now are taking multiple products because maybe something that previously wouldn't have been treated is now being treated. And so one of the things we recognize in safety research is that the more products somebody takes, the greater their risk is of having some kind of an adverse event. So I think all of these different factors are in play to kind of increase what we're seeing as more people having adverse events as the time goes along. All right, so I just briefly wanted to touch on the FDA approval process. Not really to spend a lot of time on each part of it, but to sort of point out some of the limitations to this process that can then lead to the importance of what we call post-marketing research. And so what we see here is the green box where it represents when a product's approved. And we're all aware that prior to a product being approved, there's really 3 major phases of pre-marketing studies. Phase 1 is typically healthy volunteers, people who don't have the condition of interest, but are really being tested just to see, is this product even safe to put in humans? And so phase 1, again, are very small studies, very short studies, sometimes even just a day or two. And then we progress along. If a product does well in phase 1, it goes to phase 2 and subsequently on to phase 3. And phase 3 is really the last hurdle before a product gets onto the market. And so what we notice is a few things. One is as we go up to phase 3, we get larger and larger studies. They're longer term. They look at comparisons, comparing one product to another. But what you notice is, again, we're still talking thousands to tens of thousands of people, even in phase 3 studies. And the duration may be months to years, but not incredibly long when you start thinking about kind of long-term use of a product. And so thousands sound like a lot. for a study, tens of thousands even. But again, when we think about how many people are going to take a product once it gets on the market, that's a very small number. So, the small size of these studies, the relatively short duration, really make it important that once a medication is approved and physicians can prescribe it, it gets out there, many more people start taking it. And so the purpose of phase 4 research, which is what I've been involved in, is to see how safe is something in all those people in the real world who start taking the drug once it's approved. There's a whole other side of that called, again, effectiveness, how well something works in those patients as well, which I won't get into here. But the idea is once we get it out there in the real world, once a drug is approved, the number of people who take it just explodes. And so a lot of issues come up that we might have missed in the earlier studies. So again, what are some of the limits of these pre-marketing studies? One, again, relatively short duration. We're talking months to years, which again, some of these are still longer studies, but you're not going to see events that happen that require a lot of latency. And so very acute events that happen very shortly after somebody takes a medical product, and they may be caught in a pre-marketing study, but really longer-term events that may take months or years of taking a medical product, you're not going to see. Small sample, again, even phase 3 studies start to get pretty big, thousands of people, tens of thousands, but when you think about that number compared to millions taking a drug on the market, again, you're going to miss a lot. And so a lot of what are missed are rare adverse events that maybe take a long time to develop or are very, require many people to be taking a product for them to creep in. So small sample size is another issue. And the other thing about clinical trials, pre-marketing in particular, is again, the idea is they really want to prove that this drug product works and that it's safe. And so to do that, they have a very homogeneous population. There's a lot of inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, and so a lot of people who will end up using a medical product once it's approved aren't included in the initial studies. And so we talk about elderly people, people with multiple comorbidities, women and children for many years. We're not included in those pre-marketing studies, yet these are the people who will be taking the product once it gets on the market. And so one of the big areas is to think about, well, this very narrowly defined population was used pre-marketing. Well, that population explodes once the drug is approved and starts being used. So this is, to get at some of these points in a little further detail, this is a table that looks at a number of common medical products many of us, I'm sure, have heard of, and it shows in the last two columns, the first is how many years it's spent in clinical trials. So how many years from when it started phase 1 to it completed phase 3 and was approved. And on the far right, we see the number of volunteers that were included in the pre-marketing studies. And so we very quickly can see a couple of things. Number one is the studies, although some of them are up to 7+ years, are still relatively short. And we also see that many of them are rather small, right? We see some that are 10,000, 20,000, but again, when we think about how many people use a product once it gets approved, that's still relatively small. And to kind of put that in perspective, rosuvastatin is another very common statin product that's used, very similar to Crestor. And just, I think it was last year, there were 21 million prescriptions in the United States for rosuvastatin. And when we look back at when Crestor or Lipitor, was going through, there were 20,000 people in the pre-marketing studies. Viagra is another common one, right? 7 million prescriptions last year in the United States alone, and about 3,000 people were included in the pre-marketing studies. And so the point here is just to point out is that even though some of these studies are getting larger in size in the pre-marketing setting, we're still really small compared to who's actually going to be using the product once it gets approved. All right, different populations, again, pre-marketing studies are very selective in terms of who can get in them and who can't, because they really want to prove definitively that a medical product works and that it's safe, but it's usually in a very homogeneous population. And so on the left here, we see a plot that compares the age of patients included in clinical trials for cardiovascular medication and then the population that was actually using it once it was approved. So the black bars here represent the clinical trial population, the pre-marketing population, and the white and gray bars represent the real users. And so what we really get out of this is that the preclinical studies are often done, or pre-marketing studies are often done on a much younger population, and the post-marketing users are actually typically older. And so again, we typically see this for most products, and that the pre-marketing studies tend to be younger patients, but then once a product is released on the market, older patients can start using it, and we don't know really how well it works or how safe it is in older patients. On the far right is looking at diabetes studies. And so the key thing with this graph is to show that gray bar is the people who were included in the pre-marketing studies, and the black bar represents the people in the real world who are using the product. And what's along the x-axis is number of hypoglycemic events or hyperglycemic events, meaning essentially negative or adverse consequences of diabetes. And so what we see pretty quickly is the gray bars tend to be to the left of the black bars, meaning that the people who are in the pre-marketing studies tended to have better controlled diabetes than the people who are in the real world using the drug. And the other thing we see, and for the most part, is the gray bars are a lot narrower than the black bars, meaning that the population that was in the pre-marketing studies was very homogeneous in terms of how they control their diabetes, whereas once it gets on the market, we see a much more heterogeneous population. So we see a lot wider spectrum of how well people are controlling their disease. And so again, it gets at this issue of the people who we studied in the pre-marketing studies may not necessarily reflect who actually uses a medical product. So this was a recent study that came out. On the left here, we'll talk about this plot. And so oftentimes when a product is first approved, it takes a little while for enough people to start using it for enough time for us to really see anything as far as the safety issue. And so this plot on the left, on the x-axis is time since FDA approval, and these are all products that have been approved since 2001. And on the y-axis is the proportion of medical products that had some form of a safety event. And so I'll talk on the next slide about what I mean by safety events. But what we see pretty quickly is, in the first couple of years, very few. But as we get out to 4, 5, 6 years since a medical product was approved and released, we see, more than 20% of them had some form of a safety event occurring. And then as time goes on, we see even more. And so again, this is a pretty common issue. A lot of new products, when they come on the market, it takes a little while, but we see some form of a safety issue that we didn't see necessarily in the pre-marketing arena. On the far right just kind of shows a different view of this, and this breaks it up by type of medical product. So the different classes of therapies and which ones tend to have more issues. And it looks like the blue bar here on the top is the one that seems to progress to having issues more quickly, and those are psychiatric medications. And so that may be more related to the disease that's being treated than the products themselves. But again, we see some differences not just over time, but also between different therapy groups in terms of who has these issues and who doesn't. All right, so this is a table from this recent publication that lists basically all the medical products that were approved between 2001 and 2010. And so the key thing to note with this table is you see there's a little blue dot. The blue dot represents when the product was approved and subsequently allowed to be prescribed, things like that. And then we see after that blue dot for a lot of these medical products, we see other dots. So we see a yellow or orange dot, and that represents sort of what's called a post-marketing safety communication. And this is kind of the lowest level of a safety issue where it's not really a big problem, but they send some kind of a communication to physicians, to patients, just to say, we've seen some reports of this particular thing happening, just be on the lookout, basically. So the orange dot represents that situation. The black dot is kind of the next step up when it comes to a safety issue. It's what's called a box warning. And a box warning is essentially just what it says. It's a box warning on the label for the drug. And so whenever you fill a prescription, it should come with a little label that's typically rolled up really tight and folded up, but it basically describes everything you could possibly ever want to know about this drug product. And if a safety issue comes up that's important enough, what they'll typically do is at the very top of that label, you'll see a black box, and in there will be that information. So that's kind of the next step up in severity, is if you have a black box warning. And the very last, the red dot, represents withdrawal. So sometimes a product has such a severe issue once it's on the market that it actually has to be withdrawn. And so we can see really the spectrum of issues that have come up between the blue dot when something is approved and then subsequently issues come up years later, some of them simple as a communication, and others all the way up to a product being withdrawn. So again, where do post-marketing studies really give us value? And so most of my research in recent times has been in what we call phase 4 or post-marketing research, meaning after a product's been approved and everyone can use it, what do we see in terms of safety and also effectiveness? So some of the key things are we can really start to pick up rare adverse events. And so as I mentioned, the pre-marketing studies are relatively small. But again, once we get in the real world setting, more and more people start using a product, we can start picking up some of these rare events. I won't address this too much here, but there's also a huge area of research into effectiveness versus efficacy, right? Effectiveness is how well something works in the real world. Efficacy is how well it works kind of in a controlled setting of a clinical trial. So a big buzzword is comparative effectiveness research has become a really popular area. And I won't talk too much about that today, but again, that's another big part of post-marketing research is how well does something really work once it's actually used. And again, probably the biggest area of safety and effectiveness research in the post-marketing setting is how well or how safe is a product in people with different characteristics. And so we can think of all different people who probably weren't included necessarily in the pre-marketing studies, the elderly, people on multiple drug products, people with lots of comorbidities, often are excluded from pre-marketing research. But once a product's approved, these are the people who are going to be using it. And so a lot of post-marketing research is to look at how safe something is in these patients. All right, so let's start with when I talk about post-marketing research, what do I mean? And so post-marketing research often begins with surveillance, right? Just like a lot of other public health areas, surveillance is really the first warning system that something might be going on. And so there are a number of different surveillance systems available in the United States for drug safety. The two at the top are probably the ones most people are aware of. The FDA MedWatch, or Adverse Event Reporting System, is one. And then the other one is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. So the FDA one is for drugs, and the vaccine one is for vaccines. But again, both of them are sort of systems meant to capture, be a first warning that we might have something going on here. There are also manufacturer databases. Certain manufacturers, when they get a drug approved, they have to meet certain post-marketing commitments, and one is sometimes to create a registry of users to find out who's using their product and what events they're having. So there's sometimes manufacturer-specific databases. And then there's a variety of others as well. The one I'll mention is Dawn, which unfortunately has been discontinued. But Dawn was one that used emergency department visits as a surveillance, where they looked for people who were being admitted to the emergency department because of some medical product, and they essentially kind of did some surveillance using that data. And so I'll mention that one in a little bit. But again, there's a variety of different surveillance systems out there. Some are very specific to a certain drug, some are specific to a therapeutic area, and I'll talk about a couple of these in a little more detail. So one of the real areas of opportunity and challenge with post-marketing research is how do we analyze surveillance data? And this isn't unique to drug safety. This is really unique to any surveillance of public health issues, is how do we separate the signal from the noise, right? Because as I mentioned earlier, there's 2 million reports per year approximately of adverse events. And how do we separate out many of them which may not be important or may not even necessarily be related to a medical product and hone in on the ones that are a problem, that need us and more attention? So being able to separate the signal from the noise is not something that's easy to do. I mentioned a couple of methods here. They fall into two major buckets: numerator-based methods, which just look at counts of events over time and whether they exceed expectations, and then denominator methods, which try to not just consider counts of events, but also the population at risk, and sort of put those two pieces of information together to try to identify issues. Again, there's a lot of opportunity here for improvements. I think this is an area where computer science can be of tremendous value, machine learning methods, all of which can take some of this huge amount of data that we have and sift through it more efficiently. And so I think this is one of the areas where there's tremendous value in future research. Briefly, I wanted to touch on the FDA MedWatch system. So the FDA MedWatch system is probably the best known of all the adverse event reporting or surveillance systems out there. At one time, it was all form-based, right? And so like most things, it's now transitioned online, although you can still use the form. And so the idea is if an event occurs to a patient, and a patient can report to the MedWatch system, a physician, if one of their own patients has an issue, they can report, and then manufacturers are also required to report if things come up. So one of the things that's important to note about the MedWatch system is that for patients and physicians, it's voluntary. So you're requested to report to the FDA if you're taking a medical product and something happens, you should report it to the FDA. But again, oftentimes physicians and patients are busy, they don't have time to fill these forms out, maybe they're not sure it was caused by the drug product, and so it doesn't always get reported. Manufacturers, on the other hand, often as part of their post-marketing commitment, have to report things that they find out about through this system. The problem is, how are they going to find out about it if the patients and the physicians don't report it, right? And so one of the big issues with the FDA MedWatch system is it's likely suspect to underreporting. That said, it does contribute a tremendous amount of value as a warning system to potential issues to be aware of. So quetiapine, or better known as Seroquel on the market, you sometimes see this one on TV. It's a very popular antipsychotic medication that's used to treat people with a variety of disorders, but schizophrenia and bipolar disorder are a couple of the more common ones. And after it was on the market for a little while, they started to get case reports of patients through the MedWatch system who were taking this product and had arrhythmias, no history of arrhythmias, and they started having heart arrhythmias. And so they investigated these case reports in a little more detail, and what they found, interestingly, was they kind of fell into two buckets. One group of patients, about half the cases, were taking not only Seroquel, but a bunch of other medications simultaneously, and some of those were interacting and causing these issues. The other thing they noticed was that patients were taking too high of a dose, and so about half the cases were in that bucket. And so what ended up happening was in 2011, the FDA put out an announcement to just warn physicians to be careful when you're prescribing this drug, A, to make sure patients aren't taking some of these other drugs, and also to be wary of too high of a dose. And they also updated the drug label as well. The Ambien story is another success story of drug surveillance in the post-marketing setting. Many of us, I'm sure, are aware of Ambien, right? It's a hypnotic medicine, but it's a sleep aid, basically. It's out there. It's been approved since 1992 as a treatment for short-term insomnia, and has been very well received. Lots of people use Ambien or similar products. And so the DAWN network, though, and some of this got into the news as well, started to identify a lot of people coming to the emergency department having accidents either in their car or around their home. And they started to notice that this was an increasing phenomenon and that a lot of them had taken Ambien the night before. And so they started to, through this DAWN network, which again monitors emergency department visits, they started to notice this pattern. And what they also noticed, interestingly, is displayed down here. The overwhelming majority of these cases were females. And so they noticed that about 2/3 of these accidents were females who had taken Ambien and older patients. And so they did a little bit of investigating into this, and what they recognized very quickly was that females weren't included as much as they should have been in the pre-marketing studies. And actually, females and older patients metabolize zolpidem, which is the active product, much slower than males. And so what ended up happening was, and this again was broadcast a little bit, was the FDA recommended dose changes. And so now for Ambien, females are supposed to have the pills and take half the dose of what was originally prescribed. And so again, this was the case where a lot of the surveillance data allowed us to make some changes to how things are prescribed to avoid some of these issues. Cough and cold medicine use, another example I wanted to briefly touch on. Again, those of us young children know that the landscape for cough and cold medicine in children has really changed. When I was a kid, there was cough and cold medicine available, whatever for anything you needed, even down to infants. They had these types of products available. In 2007, though, a consumer group brought a concern to the FDA that really these products are out there, but we don't know if they work and we don't know if they're safe in children. They weren't really tested in children, and yet they're being used a lot. And so this consumer group raised this red flag to the FDA, and the FDA then decided to take some actions. And one was they removed infant formulations from the market, and they also recommended that physicians be wary of prescribing any of these types of products to children less than 4 years of age. And so they also recognized at the time, though, that they didn't really know how much of a safety issue was this. Were lots of children having safety issues? And so what they did was they created, at that time in 2008, what's called the Pediatric Cough and Cold Safety Surveillance System, which is just basically a national database that tracks children having adverse reactions to cough and cold medicines. And so what they did was they did a lot of research after that. This was a relatively recent paper, but basically trying to get a sense of, well, how big is this problem? Are a lot of children having adverse reactions? And what they found was really it wasn't as prevalent of a problem as they thought. It was still a relatively rare event for a child to have a severe health reaction to a cough and cold medicine. But what they did notice was a couple of interesting things. One of them was that most of the time when it happened, it was on a pediatric formulation of the medical product, not the adult formulation. For a lot of cases, they thought maybe it was just children taking the adult formulation of a medical product that was causing the issue, but they found it was actually the pediatric products. And they also found, interestingly, and I highlight this middle bar here, that most of the cases, the majority, were children actually taking the product themselves. It wasn't that a parent, the kid was sick and they gave him the wrong dose or something. It was actually a child ingesting it themselves or having their sibling dose them for some reason. And so what they realized very quickly was that this is really what they need to communicate to parents, is be careful about your child getting a hold of these medicines, be careful of their sibling, et cetera. So it led to some more proactive information for physicians to kind of prevent additional adverse reactions. So challenges with surveillance data, I've alluded to a few of them already. Probably the biggest one is many of these systems are voluntary, right? So the MedWatch system and BERD, the vaccine version, are voluntary. And anytime a system is passive or voluntary, you're going to get under recording. And so they estimate that about 10% of serious events or severe events actually get reported. And so again, it becomes a real issue because a lot of what's out there is not getting reported and so can't be acted upon. Other issues too, again, it's hard to attribute issue, right? So if somebody's on multiple products, it's hard to know, well, which product caused the event. And so attribution based on a surveillance system is very, very difficult. It's not great for long latency events, right? It works pretty well for something that happens immediately after somebody takes a drug product, like an anaphylactic reaction, or something that's very clear to attribute. But if it's something that takes some time, then it's not so good and it's easy to track in a surveillance system. And then the last piece is really kind of an opportunity is the analysis is tricky. You know, we get lots and lots and lots of data, but how do you sift through it and separate the signal from the noise? And I think that's an area of tremendous opportunity because, you know, there are machine learning methods, computer science colleagues who could collaborate to better the system and to try to make it a little bit more proactive. All right, I wanted to point out, though, a couple of variations on surveillance that are relatively new and novel. One of them is called PRISM. And so PRISM was developed and launched shortly after the 2009 influenza pandemic, right? We had the H1N1 suddenly appear. There was cases in Mexico and in other places throughout the world, and it got a lot of attention, and they ended up creating a separate or new vaccine to address this particular strain of influenza. But what they were really concerned about was the history of flu vaccines, right? Those of us who have read about flu vaccines know that there's been issues in the past. In the 70s, there was a similar circumstance where there was a new novel strain of influenza that came along. They rushed a vaccine out and ended up leading to some health issues. And so PRISM was created as a way to kind of track how well this new vaccine they just created works, and are there safety issues that we need to be aware of. One of the big ones is what's called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a very rare outcome, but again, was seen in the 70s with the other vaccine. So they created this system, PRISM, which was essentially a network of health databases. It looked at health insurance companies, claims databases, insurance, immunization registries, all different types of large-scale post-marketing databases kind of came together to form this system. And the idea was they wanted to track people who got the vaccine and then find out if they subsequently had a hospitalization for one of these outcomes. And the good news is the system worked pretty well. And also they found that, as I highlight here on the far right, there really wasn't any signal, there was no real issues with this vaccine. It was relatively safe, and they didn't see it increase in some of these events they were concerned about. The FDA Sentinel Initiative is sort of another attempt to take this approach that PRISM used and apply it more widely. And so this was something that came out of the Amendment Act of 2007. And essentially the Amendment Act started the Sentinel Initiative, which was the same sort of idea. It's a network of post-marketing databases. So it's health insurance databases, large hospital databases, academic databases, things like that have all kind of come together to share their data and identify ways to proactively find safety issues before they go along too far. So because they've got lots of different databases, they've got a tremendously large sample size, and it's a system that allows more proactive approaches to surveillance. It allows us to look and see, well, if we're concerned about, say, Guillain-Barré syndrome with a certain product, can we actually look for it in advance instead of having to wait for reports to start coming in? And so this is an attempt to kind of try to become a more active surveillance system. All right, so now we get through, once we get by the surveillance, now we need to think about more formal types of post-marketing studies. And so when I talk about those, what do I mean? Well, again, a lot of post-marketing studies that are done are very much the same types of studies that we do in our EPI 101 class, right? We talk about ecologic studies, sort of a first look as a population level as to whether problems are coming up with a new product. We then look at meta-analyses of randomized trials. This is a way to sort of take advantage of the strengths of randomized trials but take stock of some of their limitations by, instead of just having one trial, combining them into a single large meta-analysis to see if we can target some of those rare events we couldn't see in individual trials. And we also see kind of your standard case control studies. We see your standard cohort studies as well. So all the different types of studies that we learn about in our EPI courses are applied in a post-marketing setting. And as we talk a little more about these, there's some unique challenges we need to consider. But again, pretty much all the study designs that we've used in our intro EPI courses are used here. So let's talk about a few examples. This is the rotavirus vaccine. And so those of us who maybe have taken infectious disease courses are aware of rotavirus. Rotavirus is a very common virus. It infects children when they're young, and it causes typically a little bit of stomach upset, a little bit of gastroenteritis and diarrhea. And in a country like ours with a developed health system, it really stops there. Typically, children can be given fluids and they are fine. But in less developed countries, rotavirus is a big problem because children get dehydrated and they can't recover. So it contributes a tremendous amount of mortality each year. And so there's been a real push since really the 80s and 90s to develop a vaccine for rotavirus. And rotavirus vaccine was developed initially in the 90s. There was one called RotaShield, which was marketed in 1998. It was first launched and was very effective at preventing rotavirus infection. But the problem was it caused a very rare but very severe adverse event called intussusception, which is essentially where the person's bowel kind of folds in on itself. It's an extremely painful condition, extremely rare, but got a lot of press and a lot of news. And so what ended up happening was they had to withdraw RotaShield from the market. And so for a while, we didn't have a rotavirus vaccine out there. And then in 2006, a new vaccine came out called RotaTech, which is a Merck product, and then RotaRix, which is a GSK product, came out in 2008. And so they're now on the market, and most kids now, at least here in the United States, they get them as part of their course. But because of the safety history and the issues that we had with RotaShield, safety has been a big concern with these vaccines. And so one of the issues they were worried about were seizures. Like, were these vaccines increasing seizures in children once they get them? And so what they did initially, and this was just published a short while ago, was they said, well, as a first stab at this, let's look and see at seizures before these products were on the market and after, and see if the rates of seizures in this age population changed dramatically after the products were released compared to before. And so what this study basically did was it looked at that very issue. It collected population-level data on seizures in young kids and found that really there was no change in seizure rates, so appreciable change in seizure rates from prior to these vaccines being on the market to after them being on the market. And so this was one of the first kind of clues that have come up recently to deal with some of the concerns on safety of these two new vaccines. All right, ecologic studies, again, all the issues we have with them in regular EPI 101 course are come up here, right? This is population level data. And so we can't always assume that the kids who got a seizure there had the vaccine or didn't. And so, again, we can run into lots of issues with ecologic studies. And again, they're not any less suspect to those issues in post-marketing safety as they were when we talk about them in our EPI 101. Meta-analyses are another large area of post-marketing research. And so, as I mentioned, the idea of a meta-analysis is to combine randomized trials together and try to get enough sample for us to be able to identify risks that maybe a single trial on its own couldn't identify. And so this is a classic example. This is rosiglitazone, better known as Avandia, and heart attack. And so this was an issue that came up in the 2000s, the early 2000s. Avandia was a diabetes treatment, very, very successful, but they started to notice they were getting case reports of people taking Avandia and having heart attacks. And so there was this concern that they were linked in some way. And it wasn't something they saw in full force in the studies prior to marketing. But what they then did was they did a meta-analysis where they combined a bunch of these smaller studies together. And then what they did was they said, well, can we find a risk here? And they did. They found a slightly elevated risk of heart attack in these meta-analyses. Again, the odds ratio was 1.43. So again, not dramatically increased, but they did find that there was an increase in heart attack risk in people taking Avandia compared to people taking other similar products. And so this led to quite a bit of news. A lot of patients wondered, should I stay on this product? Should I switch to something else? Some people swore by Avandia. They said it was the best product they'd taken, so they didn't want to switch. And so it ended up leading to a black box warning in the Avandia label, but it's still on the market. So again, it's a balance of risks and benefits here, but this is one of the classic examples of meta-analyses. So what are some of the problems with meta-analyses that I think are another opportunity for more research is, again, they're typically more hypothesis generating. One of the biggest challenges, which is true in this area as in other areas, is how do you handle heterogeneity between studies, right? Not all studies are the same. Not all clinical trials involve the same populations, have the same criteria. And so because of that, because of this heterogeneity, you sometimes have to ask yourself, is it really appropriate for us to lump those studies together? And so again, I've not done a lot of meta-analysis myself, but again, this is the Avandia studies that we talked about. And all I'm doing here on the far right is highlighting these are some of the ones that were combined in this meta-analysis. And what we see here on the far right is the characteristics of the patients in those studies. And so what we see is that males, the proportion who are male varied quite a bit. This is the column here. You know, some cases down in the 40s, up cases to the 80s. And so what we notice here is just this sample of studies, there's quite a bit of difference in the demographics of the different study populations. And also on the far right is the glycated hemoglobin measurement, which is a measure of diabetes control. And what you notice there as well is for case studies that had those measurements, these studies were quite different. And so this is not unique to this area, but combining studies that are often very different can be very tricky. All right, so now let's talk about a couple of sort of more typical examples of epidemiologic studies that looked at drug safety issues. And so this was a classic case control study that looked at a drug called diethylbestrol, or DES for ease of pronunciation, and cancer. And so this was a product that was marketed between 1940 and about 1971. And it was a product marketed to pregnant women as a way to prevent pregnancy complications and miscarriages. And so it was heavily marketed, or advertisements really encouraging women to take this product, that it was a way to prevent pregnancy complications. And as a side note, it ultimately proved not to really be effective at what it was marketed to do, but to focus on the safety side of it, they started to notice a rare phenomenon in case reports of females who were developing very rare cancers of the cervix and vagina at very young ages. And so they started to get case reports of these coming in, and one of the common links they found between these case reports was that their mothers had taken DES during their pregnancy. And so because of this, they decided to conduct a case control study, which they did, and the results are here. Again, very hard to see. It's an older study, but it showed definitively that mothers who took DES during pregnancy greatly increased the risk of their daughters having this very rare cancer. And so this was a study that led to DES being removed from the market. And again, it's not used for that anymore. But again, case control study was really the way that they were able to study this issue. And because it was something that didn't happen to the mothers who took the DES to their daughters, it was something that surveillance would have picked up very easily. Because again, there was some time between the mother taking DES and the daughters developing this issue. Another study just came out recently. This is finasteride, or better known as Propecia, and rhabdomyolysis, which is rhabdomyolysis is a muscle disease that causes breakdown of muscle tissue. And it becomes a problem because it can then damage the kidneys. And so this has been in the news, this condition, rhabdomyolysis, quite a bit. It can be linked to extreme exercise as well, which got some press. But this was Propecia, a fairly commonly used medical product. Again, for things like male pattern baldness, and also for benign prostate hyperplasia. And so this is a fairly commonly used product, and there were reports of people taking Propecia developing rhabdomyolysis. And so there was some concern over whether that's a real association and whether it needs to be investigated. So they just recently did a cohort study, and what they found actually was there was a mildly increased risk, but it wasn't substantial, it wasn't significant. And there were a lot of limitations to this particular study. So the conclusion really from this study was it doesn't look like the use of Propecia and related products increases the risk of rhabdomyolysis. And so again, this is a cohort study that allowed us to sort of assess this fairly rare event, but very severe event. And so even though it's rare, if this was something that they found, a lot of people take Propecia. So it would be something we would want to get out there and communicate. So now that we've talked about a few examples of the studies, I want to kind of talk about some of the real challenges that we get into when we do post-marketing safety studies. And they really come in three buckets here. How do we define a database? How do we define exposure? And then something we call confounding by indication, which is something that's unique in many ways to this type of research. So I wanted to touch on each one of those briefly. One of the challenges I mentioned earlier was we have a lot of data out there now. We think of all the different health claims databases, electronic medical record databases, hospital databases. There's a lot of data that's available to us. But one of the challenges in post-marketing safety research is how do we find the right database to do the study that we want to do? All of these different databases have different advantages and disadvantages. And so often the choice that we have to make depends on what we're wanting to study. And so one of the studies I worked on prior to coming back to GW looked at antibiotic use and acute liver failure. So there have been reports of people taking antibiotics and suffering from an acute liver injury. They may end up in the hospital either in a liver failure or related conditions. Very rare event, but we were seeing case reports of it. And so if we think about designing a study to look at antibiotic use in liver failure, we need to think about, well, what do we really need as far as data? And what we need is a lot of people, right? We need a lot of prescriptions of antibiotics because this is a very rare event. But we don't necessarily need a lot of follow-up time because typically this is occurring acute liver failure very shortly after or even while a person's taking antibiotics. And so when we think about what data set would be good for this, we would think about the fact that while we need lots of people, we don't need to worry about long-term follow-up. And so this is the type of study that would likely get channeled to like a claims-based health insurance type of database. But then we think about another study looking at, say, estrogen risk and endometrial cancer, right? So this is something that's occasionally been in the news, is this link between these two. And again, this is another rare event, right? So endometrial cancer is a rare event in estrogen users, so we need lots of people in our study in order for us to potentially pick up this risk. But again, one of the differences between this and this first one is this is something that happens after years potentially of use. And so this is an example where we need a database that has lots of people in it, but also has long-term follow-up on those people. And again, some claims databases, health insurance databases, may not be the right fit here because people change health insurances, they bounce in and out of different health insurances. And so when we think about this type of question, we need to think about a database that, again, has lots of people, but has longer-term follow-up on those people. And then another one I will mention is there's always interest in how safe are the vaccines that we're taking, particularly flu and some of the more common ones. And so there's always been this concern about Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a very rare paralysis-based event that has occasionally been linked to vaccines. And so there's been interest in studying, for example, in PRISM, they were interested in studying whether that H1N1 vaccine increased the risk of outcomes, and one of them was GBS, Guillain-Barré syndrome. And so when we think about this type of study, though, this is still an extremely rare event. So we need a lot of people who have gotten the flu vaccine, for example, for us to be able to pick it up. And we also need to think about the fact that in this day and age, people don't always just get their vaccines from their doctors, right? You can go to Target, you can go to CVS, you can get your vaccine. And so we still want to be able to track those people. And so a study such as this one really needs to think about linking together a bunch of different types of data. So for example, maybe health insurance databases, maybe hospital databases, and then there are things like vaccination registries out there. And so again, the different types of studies that we're doing, the different outcomes and exposures, we need to often think of what are the types of databases that we can use most effectively. Exposure is a real challenge in these studies, as it is in a lot of epidemiologic studies, but it becomes even more of a challenge here because people don't always take the product the way they're prescribed to take the product, right? So people will miss doses, maybe they'll change their dose, maybe they'll switch from one product to another, maybe in the same class. Maybe they'll switch from a generic to a name brand or vice versa. And so all of these types of changes are all changes in exposure. And so we need to think about how can we capture those changes in such a way that we can account for it in our analysis. One sometimes comes up is, can you just classify people as ever versus never users? And so in safety research and in a lot of other areas, we need to be really careful about avoiding ever versus never exposure, because we can think about all kinds of issues with that. The window of interest also changes depending on what the outcome is, right? When we think about acute liver failure and antibiotic use, the window is very easy to identify. It's right before they had the acute liver event. But when we think about, for example, congenital anomalies in pregnant women, oftentimes we need to think about, well, what window really matters? And so we did some research on pregnancy complications and congenital anomalies, and again, finding that window is not easy. And it also becomes a challenge to kind of interview women to find out about what they took maybe in their first trimester or even prior to conception. because that could be important for some of these anomalies. But again, it's often not easy to collect. The other thing that becomes interesting with medical products and exposure are new users. And so when somebody starts a new medical product for a variety of different reasons, it can often tell us something about that. And so if it's somebody who's just starting out with a new drug, it may be that they just got diagnosed. They're just, for example, a brand new diabetes patient, so they just got diagnosed. They're relatively early in the disease course, and so they're starting something new, a new product. I think that could be one circumstance. The other time, though, this becomes an issue is people who switch between different products. And so if we see somebody who's a new user of diabetes drug A, it could have meant that they did really poorly on diabetes drugs B, C, and D, and so they're switching to A because they've had diabetes for a long time, they're having trouble with their glycemic control, and so we're trying something new. And so it's often important whenever we see new users of a drug product to think about, well, why are they new users? And those characteristics can be really important as we start thinking about designing a study to look at safety issues. All right, one example of the ever versus never debate came up recently. This was a study that identified an increased risk of behavioral problems in children for mothers who took acetaminophen during pregnancy. And so what they did was they identified a group of mothers, they interviewed them as to whether or not they took acetaminophen during their pregnancy, and then what they did is they subsequently looked on to see did their children have behavioral problems measured at year 7. And what they found was that there was a slight increased risk of behavioral problems in women who took acetaminophen during pregnancy compared to women who didn't. And so the problem with the study got a lot of press, got a lot of people asking about whether acetaminophen is safe in pregnancy or not. And one of the real limitations of this study was that they only asked a yes/no question. They said, did you take acetaminophen during your pregnancy, yes or no? And so they basically lumped everybody into either a yes or a no. And we can think about all kinds of issues with that, right? I mean, a woman who took 2 acetaminophen on one day of her pregnancy would count the same as somebody who took 2 acetaminophen every day of her pregnancy. And we didn't consider, did you take the acetaminophen during the first trimester, second trimester, right before delivery? So again, we can think about all the issues with how they defined exposure. And when people sort of dug into this study, this was one of the big areas they emphasized, was ever versus never doesn't really work for something like this. The last thing I wanted to mention was confounding by indication. And so this is an issue that is really in some ways unique to real-world drug and vaccine safety research, but it's something we have to think about. And so the idea of confounding by indication is when a physician prescribes a medical product to a patient, they choose which patient gets which product. And so oftentimes this choice depends on a lot of patient characteristics. It can depend on person's disease severity. They may prescribe a different medication to somebody who's got more severe disease than somebody who's got less severe disease. It depends on their overall health. Right? If they're more healthy, physicians might be willing to take more risks for what they prescribe, whereas somebody who's not as healthy may be limited in terms of the type of products they can be prescribed. And then success on other therapies. Right? A lot of patients are switching between different medications in the same class to try to find what works best. And so all these kind of different characteristics come into play when you're choosing, when a physician chooses which product to prescribe to which patient. And so because of those choices and those characteristics, trying to find a comparison to identify whether drug A increases the risk of some outcome compared to drug B can be really challenging, because the reason someone was prescribed drug A might make them very different from the person who's prescribed drug B. This came up with a new product called ziprisidone, which is used to treat schizophrenia. This was approved in 2001, and it had some concerns when it was initially marketed regarding cardiovascular mortality. And so they wanted some additional kind of post-marketing safety analysis to see if this product increased the risk of these issues. And so they wanted to design a study to look at this, and what they found was some issues with how to identify an appropriate comparison group to ziprisidone. And so one of the things to note, and I haven't done a lot of work in mental health area, but is to know that people with schizophrenia and other mental illnesses typically have poorer health to begin with. And so they're more at risk at the baseline for cardiovascular mortality and general mortality. In addition, in this area, typically they see that new therapies are channeled to patients who didn't do so well on other therapies. And so typically when a new product reaches the market like ziprisidone, it's usually going to be prospectively prescribed to people who maybe didn't do well on other products. And so typically it's going to be prescribed to those with the most severe disease. who aren't doing well on other products. And so when we think about trying to compare zibrisidone to some other medical product, we need to think about, is that a fair comparison? Because people on zibrisidone could be more severe than people on something else in the same class. And so trying to think about finding those comparison groups is not always easy. One of the things we do a lot is propensity score matching, or propensity score methods, I should say, in drug and safety research. The way to think about these is that this box represents kind of a population of patients who could be prescribed a therapy. The size of the little circle represents their characteristics, and the bigger the circle, the more likely they're to be prescribed that therapy. The smaller the circle, the less likely they're to be prescribed that therapy. And the blue dots represent people who are actually prescribed, and the gray dots, people who weren't. And so the idea is in this population, there's people who are very likely, based on their characteristics, to be prescribed a certain medication, and others very unlikely. And so we can kind of think about this scale from people down at the lower end, small dot, and be very unlikely to be prescribed, to people at the upper end, larger dot, based on their characteristics, almost always to be prescribed this medication. And so when we're designing a study, we often try to use these measurements to kind of find this middle ground, right? We want to study people who have similar characteristics and similar likelihood of getting treated with a certain product. And even though some did and some didn't, we want to make sure that they're fairly similar. And so propensity score methods are something we use a lot. And the last couple of things I wanted to just close with in the last minute or two are balancing risks and benefits. All right, so I've talked a lot about drug risks here, and drug safety research really and vaccine safety research is not just about identifying those risks, but how do we communicate them in such a way that physicians and patients can make informed decisions. And so it's not just good enough to put a report out that something causes this risk. Instead, we need to think about, well, how can we communicate that risk so patients can balance it against their potential benefits of that therapy. And so there's all kinds of examples of where this has come up. I wanted just to touch on one that's been in the news a little bit recently. So bisphosphonates are commonly prescribed medication in postmenopausal women as a way to prevent fractures related to osteoporosis. And so bisphosphonates include drugs such as Fosamax and some of the others. And so these are very commonly used drugs. They've been shown to be very effective at preventing fractures, but sometime in like the mid to early 2000s, there started to be case reports of very rare adverse events coming up. One of which was called osteonecrosis of the jaw, which is, it sounds horrible and it actually is pretty gruesome, where actually your jaw kind of starts to deteriorate and it's very painful, but extremely rare condition. So there was a lot of news coverage of those because they were somewhat gruesome, and also because they were painful. There were some lawsuits and things that came along. There were also some evidence of these very odd fractures, like fractures in the hip bone in certain weird places. Again, very rare outcomes, but because they were fairly gruesome in their description and because they got a lot of news coverage, it led to a lot of concern among women taking these products. And what they've noticed is they've seen a precipitous drop-off in the use of these drugs over the last few years. And so when they talk about people in this area, there's a number of reasons for that drop-off, but one of the big ones is misinformation, that women are afraid to take them because of these extremely rare risks, even though they are extremely rare, and probably the benefits are going to far outweigh the risks for most women. All right, and so to close briefly here, just the future, what do I think are sort of the areas of interest? Again, I think surveillance data analysis is a big one. I think there's a lot of opportunity there for better methods that can more efficiently identify issues. Big data, again, we talk a lot about big data in all different fields, and it's just the same here in drug safety research, and that there's all kinds of opportunities out there, claims data, and electronic medical records, et cetera. But again, I think right now we're data rich in a lot of ways, but methods poor. I think we need to think of better methods to analyze these data and to more efficiently conduct these studies. And again, aging population, I think we're going to see more drug safety issues as time goes along. And then I think one of the real issues, and this isn't just in drug safety, but in a lot of other areas, are refining our discussions of risks and benefits. Because again, all drugs have risks, and being able to identify and communicate those risks effectively is really important. And I think that's an area of a lot of potential future research. All right, so I'll wrap it up there. Again, thank you so much for joining me today. If you are interested in this topic in more detail, I am actually launching a topics course this summer, which will be kind of diving into a lot more detail on some of these topics. So if you're interested, feel free to email me. My email address is here. And again, it'll be offered this summer for the first time. So thank you again. I appreciate you giving me the time, and happy to answer any questions that you might have. Yeah.
So, and my question is about the DOM. You are seeing that the DOM will use the such as the detect
Yeah.
So since you have seen this condition, and you know that the is really good, so do you know the reason for that, or how do you think that?
I mean, something like the FDA Sentinel system uses some emergency department data. So there are other sources. Dawn was a more national based, but there are other, areas. The claims databases are also used for emergency department stuff. So there are uses of that data that are still there, even though Dawn's no longer in existence. But yeah, emergency department and hospitalizations are tracked, in a lot of claims databases, medical record databases as a good source of risks of drugs. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I noticed on your slide the connection between finasteride and graphene lysis. I think you had concluded that with FDA concluded that there was no association, but the p-value was 0.06. To what extent does the FDA rely in these safety on p-values as opposed to an efficacy study?
Yeah, I mean, more than they probably should. I think, they talk quite a bit about that particular p-value, and that it was, the confidence interval was borderline, and so it's close. But again, I mean, this area of research also, there's a lot of trying to inform people on p-values and how to use them and how not to use them. And this was one of those cases where in the article, they sort of talk about some of the limits of the study and the fact that they're not sure, it's as close as they thought it was. But yeah, I think a lot of times they rely a little too much on the p-values and not as much kind of diving into the fact that we still saw an increased risk. And I know it's an area of education for a lot of, users, and the FDA is no different, and trying to rely less on p-values and more on sort of looking at the overall picture. Yeah.
Who's funding this kind of research, and is the funding, what's happening to it over time?
It's a good question. So a lot of it, the FDA has put in some requirements for, relatively recently, some requirements for post-marketing surveillance and research. So a lot of times the research itself is funded by the pharmaceutical industry, but it's because of an FDA mandate. And so there's always issues there. There's, a kind of sometimes conflicting interest, but a lot of it is funded by, some of it's through the FDA, some of it's through pharmaceutical companies, because a lot of them now are required to do some of these post-marketing studies. And so they hire different groups to do those studies. But it's a variety. Some of these studies can be very expensive, so funding is always an issue. But I think there's more of an emphasis on the post-marketing research recently. And so, but I think the pharma companies do end up contributing quite a bit. They don't necessarily work on the studies, but they help to fund them because, really there's no other source. And some of these can be extremely expensive. Yeah.
So it says, while discussing types of post-marketing research, you gave an example of social distancing. It's the
rosiglitazone, yeah.
Rosiglitazone, thank you. And heart attack, you mentioned an issue of heterogeneity between trials. I would like to know about good and bad heterogeneity or variation.
Yeah, so I mean, anytime we do a meta-analysis and we combine multiple studies together, we need to be careful that they're similar characteristics. And so in the rosiglitazone example, if you look at the different studies that were included, they had different age groups, different gender distributions and things. And so there are methods. I've not done a lot of meta-analyses myself, but again, there are methods to account for some of those differences, the heterogeneity, models, things like that, random effects. But I think it's important that whenever we do a meta-analysis to step backwards and actually look at the studies that we're trying to combine and to see if they're similar enough for us to combine or if there's significant differences that we need to consider. So again, I've not done a lot of meta-analysis myself, but I think it's important whenever we do one to just, again, take a step back and look at the characteristics of all the studies we're trying to combine and see if they're similar, see if they're different, and then think about what methods we can use to address that.
Any other questions from the WebEx people? No? All right, well, thank you guys so much.
Hello?
We've got students here. If you didn't sign in, please sign in. Please toss out
Hello?
your trash as much as clean as possible so we get invited back here. And if any students need their professional form signed, I will sign it.